The screams began at midnight. Lysander jolted awake in his modest stone dwelling, sweat streaming down his face, as the phantom agony of his nightmare clung to him like funeral shrouds. Around him, throughout the village of Mytilene, other voices joined the chorus, men, women, children, all crying out in their sleep. Their dreams turned to living nightmares that followed them into the waking world. For 7 nights now, no soul on the island of Lesbos had known peaceful rest. The young fisherman stumbled to his window, pressing his palms against the cool stone sill as he gazed out at the village below. Torches flickered in windows like desperate prayers, families afraid to let darkness claim them completely. In the harbor, fishing boats sat abandoned, their owners too exhausted from sleepless nights to venture onto the wine-dark sea that had once been their livelihood. Lysander's hands trembled as he touched the fresh scratches along his arms, wounds he had inflicted upon himself in his sleep while fleeing from the shadow beasts that haunted his dreams. Everyone bore similar marks now. The island's physician had run out of salves and bandages days ago. The gods have cursed us, old Melanthios had declared that morning in the agora, his weathered face gaunt with exhaustion. We have offended someone on high Olympus, and now we pay the price. But which god? And why? As Lysander watched, a figure emerged from the temple of Hera that crowned the hill overlooking their village. Priestess Callisto descended the marble steps slowly, her usually pristine white robes stained with ash and wine, the remnants of countless failed sacrifices and desperate prayers. Even from this distance, he could see the defeat in her posture, the way her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of unanswered supplications. A crash of pottery from the house next door made Lysander flinch. Through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbor Philon sobbing, a grown man reduced to tears by whatever horrors plagued his sleeping mind. Last night, Philon had tried to claw out his own eyes. Rather than see another moment of his nightmare, his wife had bound his hands with rope. The curse was destroying them all, one dream at a time. Lysander had been a practical man all his 23 years. The son of fishermen, grandson of fishermen, he understood the rhythm of tides and the language of wind better than the mysteries of the divine. But practicality had no power against this affliction. Medicine failed. Prayer failed. Nothing remained but to seek answers where mortals rarely dared to tread. He pulled on his chiton and sandals, grabbed his father's bronze dagger, the only thing of value he owned, and stepped into the night air. The village was eerily quiet now, the screaming having subsided into whimpers and restless shifting behind closed doors. Only the sound of his footsteps on the cobblestones accompanied him as he made his way toward the temple. Priestess Callisto was kneeling before Hera's altar when he entered, her head bowed in exhaustion rather than reverence. The great statue of the Queen of Gods loomed above them both, her marble eyes seeming to glitter with cold amusement in the lamplight. Offerings lay scattered around the altar's base, wine cups, honeyed cakes, precious jewelry, all of it ignored by the goddess they sought to appease. Priestess, Lysander called softly. Callisto raised her head, and he was startled by how aged she appeared. The woman who had officiated at his parents' funeral rites, who had blessed his sister's wedding, seemed to have gained decades in a single week. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her once lustrous black hair hung in lank strands around her face. Young Lysander, she said, her voice hoarse from chanting prayers. You should be home, trying to find what rest you can. As should you, priestess. But we both know rest is beyond us now. He stepped closer to the altar, feeling the weight of Hera's marble gaze upon him. I've come seeking answers. Answers? Callisto laughed bitterly. I have burned every incense in the temple stores, poured out enough wine to float a trireme, and recited every hymn and supplication known to our ancestors. The goddess remained silent. Then perhaps we're praying to the wrong deity. The priestess's eyes widened at his near blasphemy, but she didn't rebuke him. The curse had pushed them all beyond the comfort of conventional piety. Tell me, Lysander continued, settling cross-legged on the marble floor beside her. What do you know of dreams? Not the nightmares that plague us now, but dreams themselves, their nature, their source. Callisto was quiet for a long moment, staring up at Hera's statue as if seeking permission to speak. Finally, she sighed and turned to face him. There are old stories, she said slowly, older than this temple, older perhaps than mortal memory. They speak of a garden where dreams are born, a sacred grove that exists between the realm of gods and the world of men. It is said that from its blossoms come all the visions that visit us in sleep, both sweet and terrible. And where is this garden? If it exists, and I stress if, for these are tales from the very dawn of time, it belongs to Hera herself, hidden away in some secret corner of her divine realm, tended by her alone. Callisto's voice dropped to a whisper. They say she created it in the early days of her marriage to Zeus, when love still flourished between them, a place where she could cultivate dreams of happiness, of the perfect life she hoped to build with the king of gods. Lysander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. And what happened to those dreams? What happens to all dreams of love that meet the harsh light of reality? Callisto said with infinite sadness. Zeus's infidelities began. His wandering eye fell upon mortal women, and Hera's heart grew cold with jealousy and rage. Some say the garden withered with her love. Others claim she transformed it into something darker, a place where she cultivates nightmares to torment those who have wronged her. The pieces began to fit together in Lysander's mind, like the ribs of a ship taking shape beneath a master craftsman's hands. 7 nights ago, he said urgently. What happened 7 nights ago? What changed? Callisto frowned, considering. Nothing of note. The usual offerings, the usual prayers. Although, she paused, her eyes growing distant. There was something. A merchant ship from Crete put into harbor that evening. The captain made an offering here before continuing his voyage. A bolt of silk dyed the deepest blue, said to be the color of Hera's own robes. And I thought it strange at the time. He seemed frightened, desperate even. Most merchants offer token gifts out of habit, seeking fair winds and profitable trade. But this man, he knelt before the altar and wept. He spoke of dreams that had haunted his crew for weeks, visions so terrible that 3 of his sailors had thrown themselves overboard rather than endure another night's sleep. Lysander's blood ran cold. The curse followed them here. So it would seem. But why would Hera punish us for the sins of strangers? We have always been faithful to the Queen of Gods. This island has honored her above all others since my grandmother's grandmother tended this temple. Perhaps, Lysander said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. That's precisely the problem. He stood and began pacing before the altar, his thoughts racing. What if the garden hasn't withered or been corrupted? What if Hera has been too careful, too protective of it? Dreams aren't meant to be hoarded by one deity, no matter how powerful. They belong to all mortals, sweet and bitter alike. By keeping the garden to herself, by trying to control the very nature of dreams. She's created an imbalance, Callisto breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. The natural order is disrupted. Dreams become nightmares. Peace becomes torment. And it's spreading. Lysander turned to face the priestess, his jaw set with determination. That merchant ship was only the beginning. Soon, every island, every coastal city will suffer as we do, unless someone can reach Hera's garden and restore the balance. Callisto shook her head vehemently. No mortal can enter the realm of the gods uninvited. It would be death, or worse. Then we die by inches here, one sleepless night at a time, until madness claims us all. Lysander drew his father's dagger, its bronze blade gleaming in the lamplight. He knelt before the altar and pressed the edge to his palm, letting his blood drip onto the marble. Great Hera, Queen of Olympus, hear my pledge. I will find your garden of dreams, and I will do whatever must be done to end this curse. I offer my life as surety for my words. The blood sizzled as it touched the altar stone, and for a moment, Lysander thought he saw amusement flicker in the statue's marble eyes. Then the temple fell silent once more. You're mad, Callisto whispered. Perhaps, but madness may be what's needed. He stood and wrapped his hand with a strip of cloth torn from his chiton. I've heard stories of places where the mortal world grows thin, where determined souls might slip between the layers of reality. The old fishermen speak of such spots, caves that lead deeper than the ocean floor, groves where the trees grow in patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate. Even if such places exist, even if you could somehow reach the garden, what then? You're a fisherman, not a hero from the old songs. You have no divine blood, no magical weapons, no gods to aid you. Lysander smiled grimly. No, but I have something the heroes of legend often lacked. A very good reason to succeed. Every person on this island, every soul who will suffer this curse, if it spreads further, their pain is my strength, their hope, my weapon. He turned toward the temple entrance, then paused. Priestess, if I don't return, you'll return, Callisto said firmly. The gods may be cruel, but they're not wasteful. They wouldn't send such determination into the world only to see it snuffed out pointlessly. She rose and placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. But take this, at least. From around her neck, she lifted a small pendant, a silver amulet shaped like a peacock feather, Hera's sacred symbol. It was my grandmother's, blessed by the goddess herself in the old days when her favor was more easily won. It may offer some protection, or at least ensure you're recognized as a faithful servant rather than an intruder. Lysander accepted the pendant gratefully, feeling its subtle warmth against his chest as he slipped the chain over his head. My thanks, priestess. Tend to the people as best you can. I'll return before the next new moon. How can you be so certain? He paused in the temple doorway, looking back at her silhouetted against the altar's glow. Because the alternative is unthinkable. The journey to find a path between worlds began at dawn, though dawn brought little relief from the villages, suffering, as Lysander made his way through the narrow streets toward the island's wilder regions. He saw the toll 7 nights of nightmares had taken on his people. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, too afraid to play. Elderly folk sat in doorways staring at nothing, their minds frayed by sleepless terror. The market stalls stood empty. No one had the strength or will to engage in the simple commerce that kept their community alive. In the harbor, he found Nicias mending nets with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. The old sailor had been his father's closest friend, a man who'd weathered every storm the Aegean could conjure, and told tales of sea monsters with the casual air of one recounting a visit to the market. "Lysander, lad," Nicias called, his voice cracked with exhaustion. "Strange morning to be setting out on foot rather than by boat." "I'm seeking the old places, Nicias, the caves and groves the fishermen whisper about when they think the young ones aren't listening." The old sailor's hands stilled on his nets. "Dangerous talk, boy. Those places aren't meant for mortal feet. Desperate times call for desperate measures." Lysander crouched beside his father's old friend, lowering his voice. "The nightmares are spreading beyond our island. Soon, the whole world will know this torment, unless someone acts." Nicias studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can see the weight you're carrying. Your father had that same look when he decided to sail into the great storm to rescue those Rhodian traders. He set aside his nets and stood, joints creaking. "Very well, but if you're determined to walk paths that lead beyond the mortal world, you'll need more than courage to guide you." The old sailor led him to a weathered storage hut at the harbor's edge, its wooden walls dark with salt and age. Inside, among coils of rope and spare sails, Nicias retrieved a small wooden box carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather," Nicias said, handling the box with obvious reverence. He claimed it came from a witch of Circe's line, payment for some service rendered in his youth. "I've never opened it, never even been tempted to, but he said it contained a map of the hidden ways, paths that exist only when the need is great, enough, and the seeker's heart is true." Lysander accepted the box, feeling an odd tingling sensation in his fingers as he touched the carved wood. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because," Nicias said simply, "the nightmares showed me what happens if this curse isn't stopped. I've seen our island transformed into a place of perpetual shadow, where the living envy the dead their peaceful rest. If there's even a chance you can prevent that future, then I'd be a fool to withhold whatever aid I can offer." As if responding to his acceptance of the quest, the box's lid clicked open of its own accord. Inside, nestled in faded silk, lay a piece of parchment that seemed to be made from some material far more ancient than simple sheepskin. The moment Lysander's eyes fell upon it, words appeared on its surface, not written in any ink he recognized, but seeming to burn themselves into existence. "When dreams turn to nightmares and hope grows thin, seek the path where the world grows thin. In the grove where the silver olive grows, find the door that no mortal knows. Speak the name of the Queen of Heaven. Let your blood mark the way you're given. Step between the roots of time into realms beyond reason and rhyme. Below the verse, a map began to manifest, not of the physical landscape of Lesbos, but of something deeper, showing currents of power and possibility that flowed beneath the visible world. One path pulsed with particular brightness, leading from the harbor through the island's interior to a grove high in the hills that Lysander had never noticed, despite a lifetime of exploring every corner of his homeland. "The silver olive," he murmured. "I've never heard of such a tree." "Nor I," Nikias admitted. "But then, there are many things in this world that reveal themselves only when the time is right." He clasped Lysander's shoulder with a grip still strong despite his advanced years. "Go with the gods, lad, and remember, sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting what we fear, but in accepting what we cannot understand." Armed with the mysterious map and driven by desperate purpose, Lysander set out across the island's rugged interior. The path marked on the parchment didn't correspond to any trail he knew, yet his feet seemed to find purchase on stones that appeared beneath them at the moment of need. The landscape itself felt strange, as if he were seeing familiar hills and valleys through a lens that revealed their hidden nature. As he climbed higher into the hills, the very air began to change. It grew thicker, more charged with possibility, like the atmosphere before a great storm. Birds fell silent in the olive groves he passed, and even the ever-present cicadas stilled their droning song. The sun, though still visible overhead, seemed to cast light of a different quality, not quite the golden radiance of the mortal world, but something more silvery, more ethereal. It was past midday when he finally reached the grove shown on. The map and the sight that greeted him there stole the breath from his lungs. The olive tree that stood at the grove's heart was indeed silver, not merely silver-leafed like the common olive, but truly silver, as if it had been crafted by some divine metalsmith from moonbeams and starlight. Its trunk was massive, easily 30 feet in circumference, and its branches spread wide enough to shelter a small village. Most remarkable of all, the space beneath those branches seemed to extend far beyond what the eye could measure from outside, creating a vast, shadowy hall that felt both intimate and infinite. As Lysander approached the tree, he felt the pendant at his throat grow warm, and the words of the spell verse echoed in his memory. Queen of Heaven could refer to no one but Hera herself. He knelt at the base of the silver trunk, placed his hand upon its smooth bark, and spoke her name with all the reverence he could muster. "Hera, Queen of Olympus, Goddess of Marriage, and Protector of the Faithful, I seek passage to your sacred garden." The tree's response was immediate and overwhelming. The silver bark beneath his palm grew warm, then hot, then blazing like a forge fire. Light erupted from every leaf and branch, and the very air sang with divine power. When the brilliance faded, Lysander found himself looking not at the familiar hillside of his island home, but at a doorway that had opened in the tree's trunk, a passage lined with silver light that led into depths beyond mortal reckoning. He didn't hesitate. With one final glance at the world he knew, Lysander stepped through the doorway and into the realm of the gods, leaving behind everything familiar in pursuit of dreams that had been twisted into nightmares, and the desperate hope that he might somehow set them right. The passage through the silver olive led not down into earth, as Lysander had expected, but upward through layers of reality he had no words to describe. One moment he walked on solid ground, that rang like metal beneath his sandals. The next, he seemed to drift through clouds of crystallized starlight. Time moved strangely here. He felt as though he had been traveling for hours and mere heartbeats simultaneously. When the passage finally opened into a vast space, Lysander emerged into a realm that defied every expectation he had harbored about the dwelling places of the gods. Before him stretched a garden of impossible beauty and terrible sorrow. Flowering trees grew in perfect spirals that rose toward a sky the color of twilight pearls, their blossoms shifting through every hue imaginable as they caught light from no visible source. Rivers of liquid silver wound between beds of flowers that chimed like bells when the breeze touched them, creating melodies of heartbreaking sweetness. In the distance, marble pavilions gleamed like captured moonlight among groves of trees that bore fruit resembling clusters of stars. But beneath the beauty lay an atmosphere of profound melancholy that pressed against Lysander's chest like a physical weight. The very air seemed to pulse with suppressed emotion, longing, rage, disappointment, and a grief so deep it had crystallized into something almost tangible. This was a place where love had once flourished and then curdled into something far darker. As he walked deeper into the garden, following paths of white stone that seemed to glow with their own inner light, Lysander began to notice details that confirmed Priestess Callisto's ancient tales. Some of the flowering trees bore blossoms that moved independently of any breeze, their petals forming faces, some serene and joyful, others twisted with anguish. These, he realized, were the dreams themselves, growing like fruit on divine branches, ready to be plucked and sent into the sleeping minds of mortals. But something was terribly wrong with the harvest. The trees that should have borne sweet dreams stood withered and bare, their branches reaching toward the pearl-gray sky, like the arms of supplicants begging for mercy. Meanwhile, the nightmare trees flourished with obscene abundance, their dark blossoms heavy with visions of terror and despair. The imbalance was so severe that the very ground beneath the nightmare groves had turned black, as if poisoned by the overflow of malevolent dreams. So, a voice said behind him, rich with divine authority and barely contained fury, "A mortal dares to enter my private sanctuary." Lysander spun around to find himself face to face with Hera herself, and the sight of her nearly drove him to his knees. She was both more beautiful and more terrible than any artistic representation could capture. Tall and regal, with dark hair crowned by a diadem of peacock feathers that seemed to hold trapped starlight. Her robes shifted color like oil on water, and her eyes held depths that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension. But it was the pain in those divine eyes that struck him most forcefully. For all her power and majesty, Hera looked like a woman who had been wounded so deeply that the injury had never properly healed, leaving her to tend her hurt in isolation while it festered and grew poisonous. "Great Queen," Lysander said, dropping to one knee but keeping his gaze respectfully lowered. "I come not as an intruder, but as a supplicant. My people suffer from nightmares that steal their sleep and poison their days. I seek only to understand why, and to find a way to restore the balance that has been lost." Hera's laugh was like breaking crystal. "Balance? You speak to me of balance when your very presence here violates the natural order. Mortals should know their place, fishermen. The realm of dreams is mine to command as I see fit, yet the dreams that flow from your garden now bring only suffering," Lysander replied, risking a glance upward. "Surely that was never your intention when you first planted these sacred groves." Something flickered in the goddess's expression. Surprise, perhaps, that a mere mortal would dare to speak of her intentions. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze seeming to peer into the very depths of his soul. "What do you know of intentions, mortal? What do you know of the careful cultivation of hope, only to watch it wither beneath the harsh light of betrayal?" Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than her earlier anger. "I created this garden in the early days of my marriage, when I still believed that Zeus and I might build something beautiful together. Every tree, every flower, every stream was shaped by dreams of the love we might share, the family we might raise, the harmony we might bring to Olympus itself." As she spoke, the garden around them seemed to shimmer, and Lysander caught glimpses of what it must have been like in those ancient days. Trees heavy with golden blossoms that radiated joy, streams that sparkled with laughter, pavilions where divine love had been celebrated in all its forms. The beauty of that lost vision was almost unbearable. "But dreams," Hera continued, her voice hardening, "are fragile things. One by one, my husband's infidelities poisoned the roots of my garden. Each mortal woman he pursued, each bastard child he sired, each broken promise he made. They all fed the nightmare trees while starving those that bore sweeter fruit. And so, I learned that if dreams are doomed to become nightmares anyway, I might as well control the process." "But that's not true," Lysander said urgently, rising to his feet despite the danger of standing in a goddess's presence uninvited. "Dreams don't have to become nightmares. Yes, some do. Love can turn to heartbreak. Hope can become disappointment. But others remain pure, or even grow more beautiful with time. You've simply stopped tending the trees that bear good dreams, so they've withered from neglect." Hera's eyes flashed with dangerous fire. "You dare lecture me on the nature of dreams? You, who have lived barely 2 decades, and known only the simple desires of a fisherman's life." "I know what I've seen in my village," Lysander replied steadily. "I've seen love that endures despite hardship, hope that survives even in the face of loss. My own parents. They were married 30 years before the fever took them both. My father could have been bitter when the poor catches made feeding our family difficult, but instead he taught me to find joy in small things. The warmth of the morning sun on the water, the sound of gulls calling to their mates, the satisfaction of mending nets with careful hands. My mother could have despaired when her first 3 children were stillborn, but instead she poured all her love into my sister and me, making us feel precious beyond measure." As he spoke, something extraordinary began to happen in the garden around them. On the withered branches of the nearest sweet dream tree, tiny buds began to appear. Not many, but enough to show that the capacity for growth still existed beneath the apparent death. Hera noticed too, and her expression shifted from anger to something more complex. Surprise, perhaps, or even a fragile hope she was afraid to acknowledge. "You speak prettily," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "Yet what of the betrayals? What of the promises broken and the trust shattered? How do you maintain your faith in love when faced with evidence of its failure?" Lysander thought of his sister Panthea, whose husband had abandoned her and their infant son to seek his fortune in distant lands. He thought of how she had wept for months, how she had nearly succumbed to despair. But he also remembered what had happened next. My sister's husband left her, he said quietly. She was devastated, convinced that she would never trust or love again. But slowly, with the help of friends and family, she began to heal. She learned that his betrayal said nothing about her worth or about the possibility of finding better love in the future. Last spring, she married a widower from the next village, a kind man who cherishes both her and her son. The pain of her first marriage didn't poison her capacity for happiness. It taught her to recognize genuine affection when she found it. More buds appeared on the dream trees, and some even began to unfurl into tentative blossoms. Hera watched this development with fascination, as if she were seeing her own garden truly for the first time in centuries. But what of the nightmares that have already been released? She asked. The suffering they have caused cannot simply be undone. No, Lysander agreed, but it can be balanced. For every nightmare that has brought terror, a sweet dream could bring comfort. For every vision of despair, one of hope could remind mortals that darkness is not eternal. The garden doesn't need to be perfect, great queen. It needs to be complete. Hera was silent for a long time, walking among the trees with an expression of deep contemplation. Lysander followed at a respectful distance, watching as she paused to touch the bark of various trees, some healthy, some withered, some twisted by the overflow of dark dreams. Finally, she stopped before the largest of the nightmare trees. Its trunk so black it seemed to absorb light, its branches heavy with blossoms that writhed like living things in agony. This tree, she said softly, grows from the deepest root of all. My rage at Zeus's first betrayal, when he pursued the mortal woman Io and transformed her into a heifer to hide his infidelity from me. I have fed this root with centuries of anger, and it has grown strong indeed. She placed her hand on the twisted bark, and her touch seemed to cause the tree physical pain. It shuddered and writhed, its nightmare blossoms releasing whispers of terror into the pearl-gray sky. I do not know if I can stop feeding it, she admitted, and for the first time, her voice carried a note of genuine vulnerability. The rage has become part of me, as essential as breath or heartbeat. Without it, who would I be? Lysander stepped closer, drawn by the raw honesty in her words. You would be yourself, great queen, but freed from the burden of carrying pain that serves no purpose beyond perpetuating itself. The rage you feel, it's real, and it was justified when it first arose. Zeus wronged you terribly, and your anger was a natural response. But that was long ago. Has holding on to it brought you any satisfaction? Has it changed his behavior or healed your hurt? Hera's laugh was bitter. No. If anything, my rage has driven him further from me, confirming his belief that I am nothing more than a jealous shrew, and yet I cannot seem to let it go. Then perhaps, Lysander suggested gently, you don't need to let it go entirely. Perhaps you only need to stop feeding it new fuel. Let the rage that exists continue to nourish this tree and the nightmares it produces. Some dreams of anger and justice serve important purposes in the mortal world, but also tend the other trees, the ones that have withered from neglect. balance the darkness with light. As if responding to his words, several of the healthier trees began to show new growth. Blossoms unfurled that radiated warmth and contentment, dreams of simple joys and quiet satisfactions. A tree near the garden's heart, long barren, suddenly burst into flower with dreams of new love. Not the desperate, possessive passion that often turned destructive, but the gentle affection that grew between souls who recognized and cherished each other's worth. Hera watched this transformation with wonder, and Lysander saw tears gathering in her divine eyes. "I had forgotten," she whispered, "how beautiful they could be." She moved through the garden with growing excitement, touching trees that had stood lifeless for millennia and coaxing them back to bloom. Dreams of forgiveness flowered beside, dreams of justice. Visions of healing grew alongside acknowledgments of necessary pain. The garden was finding its balance at last, not through the elimination of darkness, but through the restoration of light. As the transformation continued, Lysander felt a change in the very air around them. The oppressive weight of accumulated grief began to lift, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. This was what the mortal world needed. Not an end to all nightmares, for some served important purposes, but a return to the natural balance between shadow and illumination, between the dreams that challenged and those that comforted. "There is something else," Hera said suddenly, turning to face him with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with lingering sadness. "The damage that has already been done, the nightmares that have already been released into the mortal world. They cannot be recalled, but their effects can be mitigated." She led him to the center of the garden, where a fountain of liquid starlight bubbled up from depths unknown. Around its rim grew flowers unlike any others, blossoms that seemed to be made of crystallized hope itself, glowing with soft radiance that banished shadows without harsh glare. "These are the dreams of healing," Hera explained. "They grow slowly and bloom rarely, for they require not just hope, but wisdom, the understanding that some wounds leave scars, but that scars can become sources of strength rather than shame." She plucked a single blossom, its light warming her divine features. "Take this back to your people. When they sleep tonight, let it rest beneath their pillows. It will not erase the memory of the nightmares they have endured, but it will remind them that they have survived, and that survival itself is a form of victory." Lysander accepted the flower with reverence, feeling its warmth pulse against his palm like a gentle heartbeat. "My thanks, great queen. But what of the other places where the nightmare plague has spread? The merchant ship that brought it to our island. They may have carried it to other ports. The balance restored here will ripple outward," Hera assured him. "As nightmares spread through connection and contagion, so too will healing dreams. It will take time, perhaps weeks, for the effects to reach every afflicted soul, but the tide has turned." She paused, studying his face with those ancient, knowing eyes. "You have given me a great gift, Lysander of Lesbos. You reminded me that tending a garden requires attention to all its plants, not just the ones that grow most easily. In return, I offer you a choice." The goddess gestured to the transformed garden around them, where dreams of every type now bloomed in careful balance. "You could remain here as the garden's mortal guardian. You would be granted immortality tasked with ensuring that the balance you helped restore is maintained, you would want for nothing, and your influence would touch every sleeping mind in the mortal world. The offer was tempting beyond measure. To live forever in this place of impossible beauty, to play a role in shaping the dreams of humanity itself. What mortal wouldn't be seduced by such a prospect? But Lysander thought of his village, of the people who had spent 7 nights in terror, and who would wake tomorrow to find peace restored to their sleep. He thought of his sister Panthea and her young son, of old Nicias mending nets in the Bee harbor, of priestess Callisto keeping faithful vigil in Hera's temple. They were his people, his responsibility, his home. "I am honored beyond words by your offer, great queen," he said respectfully, "but my place is with my people, at least for now. They will need help understanding what they have endured, and support as they heal from the trauma of those 7 nights. Perhaps, when I have grown old and fulfilled my duties to them, I might be worthy to return and serve as guardian of this sacred place." Hera smiled, not the terrible, cold expression she had worn when first confronting him, but something warm and genuinely pleased. "Spoken like a true hero," she said. "Very well. Return to your people, Lysander. Live your mortal life with honor, and know that when your time in the world below is finished, a place awaits you here among the eternal gardens." She waved her hand, and the silver doorway through which he had entered reappeared among the dream trees. But before he could step toward it, she called him back once more. "One final gift," she said, removing from her own brow a single peacock feather that gleamed with divine light. "This will serve as proof of your journey, should anyone doubt your tale. More importantly, it will ensure that you and yours are never again troubled by nightmares born of imbalance. Your dreams will always reflect the natural order, sometimes challenging, sometimes comforting, but never poisoned by forces beyond their proper scope." Lysander accepted the feather with deep gratitude, tucking it carefully into his belt beside the healing blossom. With final words of thanks and farewell, he stepped through the silver doorway and began his journey back to the mortal world. The return passage seemed shorter than his arrival, perhaps because hope now lightened his steps. Where desperation had once driven them, he emerged from the silver olive tree to find the sun setting over his island home, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed almost mundane after the pearl-gray beauty of Hera's realm. By the time he reached the village, full darkness had fallen, and he could see lights burning in every window. Families afraid to let sleep claim them without illumination, to hold back the terrors of dream. But as he made his way through the narrow streets toward the temple, he sensed a change in the very air. The oppressive weight of accumulated fear was lifting, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. He found Priestess Callisto exactly where he had left her, kneeling before Hera's altar in exhausted supplication. But when she looked up at his approach, her eyes widened with amazement. "Lysander, you're different. There's light around you, as if you've been touched by divinity itself." He smiled and withdrew the peacock feather from his belt, its divine radiance casting dancing shadows on the temple walls. "I have been so touched, priestess, and I bring hope for our people." Quickly but thoroughly, he recounted his journey to Hera's garden and the restoration of balance between sweet dreams and nightmares. Callisto listened with growing wonder, occasionally reaching out to touch the divine feather as if to assure herself that this was no sleep-deprived hallucination. "And this flower?" she asked, indicating the blossom of crystallized hope that pulsed with gentle light in his other hand. "A gift of healing for those who have suffered most from the nightmare plague." But Hera promised that the restoration of balance would spread naturally from its source. By tomorrow night, perhaps sooner, our people should find peace in their sleep once more. As if summoned by his words, they heard voices from the village below. Not screams of terror this time, but cries of amazement and relief. Through the temple's open doorway, they could see people emerging from their homes, calling to their neighbors with excitement rather than fear. "The dreams," someone shouted. "They're changing. The nightmares are fading." "I dreamed of my grandmother," another voice added, thick with emotion. "She told me that the darkness was ending, that peace was returning to our sleep." Lysander and Callisto exchanged smiles of profound relief. The healing had begun even sooner than expected. The restored balance in Hera's garden, already rippling outward to touch every afflicted soul. Over the following days, as word of the miracle spread, visitors began arriving from other islands and coastal cities. Some came seeking healing for nightmare plagues that had begun to touch their own communities. Others came simply to hear the tale of the fisherman who had dared to enter the realm of the gods and return with hope for all humanity. Lysander welcomed them all, sharing freely the story of his journey and the wisdom he had gained from his encounter with Hera. He spoke of the importance of balance in all things, between light and shadow, joy and sorrow, hope and realism. He taught that even difficult dreams served necessary purposes, helping mortals process fears and challenges they might not otherwise confront. Most importantly, he helped people understand that the 7 nights of terror had not been meaningless suffering. Like all dark experiences, they had revealed hidden strengths and brought communities together in mutual support. The healing dreams that followed were made more precious by contrast with the nightmares that had preceded them. Years passed, and Lysander lived his life with quiet honor, marrying a kind woman from a neighboring island and raising children who grew up hearing stories of their father's great adventure. He continued to fish the wine-dark sea, finding joy in simple work and the rhythm of tides that had always called to his soul. But he never forgot his promise to return eventually to Hera's garden, when his hair had turned silver and his hands could no longer manage nets with their former skill, when his children had children of their own and the village no longer needed his active protection. He made his way once more to the grove where the silver olive tree grew. The passage to the divine realm opened for him as easily as it had decades before, and he found the garden more beautiful than ever, a place where dreams of every kind bloomed in perfect balance, tended by a goddess who had remembered how to nurture hope alongside justice, comfort alongside challenge. "Welcome home, faithful guardian," Hera said, her smile warm with genuine affection for the mortal who had helped her rediscover the full beauty of her own creation. And in the village below, when children woke from particularly vivid dreams, whether sweet or challenging, their parents would sometimes tell them the story of Lysander the fisherman, who journeyed to the garden where dreams are born and helped restore the balance between shadow and light that makes both sleep and waking life meaningful. The dreams continue to flow from that sacred garden, as they always have and always will. Some bring comfort, some bring challenge, but all are touched by the wisdom that comes from understanding balance, the knowledge that even in darkness, seeds of light are waiting to bloom, and that every nightmare endured makes the next sweet dream more precious still. The end.